Story 1. The Phantom Hitchhiker. It was a chilly evening in early November when Claire Peterson set out on her drive home from work. The days were getting shorter, and a heavy fog had rolled in, thickening the cold air and limiting visibility to just a few feet ahead. Claire gripped the steering wheel a little tighter, her headlights barely cutting through the swirling mist. Her usual route took her through a lonely stretch of road that bordered the edge of a forest. It was a place known for being eerily quiet, and that night, the silence was thick enough to feel oppressive. The trees stood like dark sentinels, their skeletal branches stretching out as if trying to pull something down into the earth with them. As Claire drove, her mind drifted back to the local legend about the forest, the story of a young woman who had died in a car accident on this very road nearly 20 years ago. The woman had been hitchhiking home from a party one fateful November night when she was struck by a speeding car. Some say her spirit still haunts the road, trying to find a ride back to wherever she was going that night. Suddenly, Claire saw her. Out of the fog, a figure emerged, standing at the edge of the road, her arm raised as if to hail a passing car. The figure was a woman, dressed in an old-fashioned, tattered dress, her hair tangled and hanging in loose strands. Claire's heart jumped in her chest. She wasn't one to believe in ghosts, but the sight of the woman in the fog brought every unsettling story she had ever heard back to life in her mind. Claire hesitated for a second. There was no reason to stop. Who hitchhikes out here in the middle of the night? And yet, she found herself slowing the car, her fingers trembling as they gripped the gearshift. The woman stepped closer to the car, her pale face coming into the light of the headlights. Her expression was blank. No smile, no sadness, just a vacant stare that chilled Claire to the bone. Against her better judgment, Claire rolled down her window just an inch, enough to speak but not enough for anything unexpected. "Do you need help?" Claire asked, her voice shaking. The woman didn't respond. Instead, she walked closer, her face coming fully into view. Claire recoiled in horror. The woman's eyes, deep, hollow pits of darkness, reflected nothing. No light, no emotion, just an empty void. Claire slammed her foot on the gas pedal, speeding away into the night. She glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the woman standing in the middle of the road behind her. But the road was empty. The figure had vanished as suddenly as she had appeared. For weeks afterward, Claire couldn't shake the memory of that night. She had almost convinced herself it was a trick of the fog, a shadow. Her mind had twisted into something more. But then, she heard the news. Another driver had seen a woman matching the same description, standing on the roadside just days after Claire's encounter. Only this time the woman had gotten into the car and the driver was never seen again. Story 2. The Cabin in the Woods. Jason, Megan, and their two friends, Alex and Lisa, had been looking forward to their weekend getaway for months. The plan was simple: rent a cabin deep in the woods, away from the chaos of the city, and enjoy a relaxing weekend with good food, a roaring fire, and plenty of laughs. The cabin they found online seemed perfect. It was isolated, rustic, and perched at the edge of a lake with stunning views. When they arrived, everything seemed normal enough, at first. They spent the first night laughing around the fire pit, swapping spooky stories to get in the Halloween spirit, even though it was already November. Jason, always the skeptic, joked that the cabin was the perfect setting for a horror movie. Little did they know, they were about to live one. The trouble began the following day. The group woke up to find deep scratches etched into the wooden door of the cabin. They were long, jagged marks, almost like claw marks, but much too large to have been made by any animal they knew. Alex brushed it off, saying it was probably an old bear or a raccoon looking for food. But the scratches hadn't been there when they arrived, and something about them felt off. Later that afternoon, Megan and Lisa went for a walk in the woods. The crisp November air was refreshing, and the leaves crunched beneath their boots. But as they ventured deeper into the forest, they began to feel uneasy. The trees, tall and twisted, seemed to close in on them, and the farther they walked, the quieter it became. No birds, no wind, just an unnatural silence. Then they heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like the sound of footsteps following them from just out of sight. Megan and Lisa froze, exchanging nervous glances before turning around to head back to the cabin. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, and the feeling that someone, or something, was watching them intensified. By the time they made it back to the cabin, both women were breathless and pale. They told the others what had happened, but Jason and Alex laughed it off. "Probably just a deer," Jason said. But Megan knew what she had heard, and whatever it was, it had been walking on two legs. That night, as they huddled inside the cabin, the sounds began again, tapping, scratching. But this time, it was coming from all sides, on the roof, the walls, and the windows. The friends exchanged frightened looks, the jovial atmosphere from the night before replaced with dread. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the fire in the hearth dimmed, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Jason grabbed a flashlight and cautiously opened the front door. There, just at the edge of the clearing, stood a figure, tall, thin, and obscured by the darkness. Its eyes glinted in the weak light, and its limbs were too long, too twisted, to be human. Without a word, Jason slammed the door and bolted it shut. The group didn't sleep that night. They stayed awake, clutching whatever they could use as weapons, as the scratching and tapping continued until the first light of dawn. When the sun finally rose, they packed their things and left the cabin in a hurry, not looking back even once. Weeks later, the owner of the cabin contacted them. He wanted to know why they had left in such a hurry, abandoning the weekend halfway through. When they explained what had happened, he was silent for a long time before finally responding. "You're not the first to report strange things in that cabin," he said quietly. "Others have seen it too. Whatever it is out there, it doesn't like visitors." Story 3. The November Night Caller. In a small town tucked away in the heart of New England, there was an urban legend about a mysterious figure known only as the November Night Caller. It was said that on the coldest nights of November, the caller would come to the doors of those who were alone, knocking softly and whispering their name through the keyhole. No one knew what the caller wanted, but one thing was certain: if you opened the door, you were never seen again. Ethan, a college student home for Thanksgiving break, didn't believe in the legend. He had grown up hearing the stories from his grandparents, but as far as he was concerned, it was nothing more than a fairy tale designed to scare children. So when he found himself alone in his parents' house one particularly cold November night, he wasn't worried. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and shaking the trees in the yard. Ethan curled up on the couch, flipping through channels on the TV, barely paying attention to the news reports of strange disappearances in nearby towns. His phone buzzed, his parents checking in to make sure he was okay. He assured them he was fine, laughing at their concern. But then, just as he was about to turn in for the night, he heard it. A soft, rhythmic knock at the front door. Knock, knock, knock. Ethan froze. His heart began to race, his mind immediately flashing back to the stories he had heard as a child. But it couldn't be real. The November Night Caller was just a myth. Knock, knock, knock. The knocking continued, growing more insistent. And then faintly, he heard it. A voice, low and whispering, calling his name. Ethan, Ethan. His blood turned to ice. He grabbed his phone, his hands trembling, and called his parents. But before they could pick up, the call cut out, leaving only static. The knocking grew louder, the voice more demanding. "Ethan, open the door." He bolted upstairs, locking himself in his bedroom. The knocking and whispering continued throughout the night, growing more frantic with each passing hour. But Ethan never opened the door. The next morning, the knocking had stopped, and the house was silent. Ethan's parents returned home later that day, worried after not hearing from him. When Ethan told them what had happened, they looked at each other with grim expressions. "You were lucky," his father said quietly. "Not everyone is."